Vault for a Prince. Perhaps the most moving eulogy I ever heard was a young woman reminiscing about her sister. The deceased, a mother with two young children who had worked as a special education teacher prior to her death, had been summarily praised by a parade of folks who stood and spoke as though determined to beatify her. The last speaker was her younger sister, and she was having none of it. She took to the lectern and said, "I don't know who you all have been talking about, but I'm here to talk about my sister." She went on to lovingly recall the humorous, mischievous, and all too human side of her big sister to raucous laughter. My father was no saint. I do not say this in the cliched, hackneyed sense that implies that he lived a life of abandon or disregard, but rather that he, too, had a very human side. Just as with any man, at times he had conflicting thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and actions, and how best to reconcile contradictions and how he knew a God-loving man should conduct himself and his own deportment. For my father, Christian charity was very important, but so was promoting self-reliance within his family, his community, and as much of the world that he could influence. His love was not the easy, glib, and generous sort, but rather the type whose aim it was to allow people to stand on their own feet and provide for themselves to whatever degree was possible. If an able-bodied person looked to my father for a handout, he was likely to come away with no greater physical wealth than he had arrived. But if that same man needed help getting to his feet and standing tall, then Dad would be there with all the support he could give. From the time Dad was a young man, I know he considered himself a progressive. He would talk about how his immigrant father had been discriminated against and how he had seen the same bigotry exhibited to farm workers who had come up from Mexico and with whom he worked side by side in the Michigan fields of his youth. Perhaps the most poignant tale concerning the foul taste that blatant discrimination left in his mouth was one that happened when he was newly enlisted in the Navy. The military, then as now, has the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which is a test that not only checks accumulated previous knowledge, but is also supposed to measure potential for learning in a variety of subjects. Dad took the test and his score allowed him to take classes in electronics and to be directly involved with some of the earliest development of using radar to aim the big guns on board the ships of the 1950s. Dad was proud of his work. What he wasn't proud of was how the Navy regulated a black man who began service at the same time as Dad and had a very similar ASVAB scores as my father's to the ship's galley or kitchen. The Navy, rather than demonstrating its ability to find and train men so they could serve their country fully, had denied the other man opportunities solely because of the color of his skin. Dad thought this reprehensible. One of the ways that Dad demonstrated his human frailties was in his eagerness to stand toe-to-toe with an opponent that Dad thought was on the wrong side of a cause. A classic example of Frank playing David to another's Goliath actually occurred during Mass, and the man he opposed was the parish priest. My family was members of St. Peter's Parish in Olney, Maryland, but the day Dad stormed the pulpit and had words with the Father were at another nearby parish, St. John the Baptist. St. Pete's is in a more rural part of the Maryland suburbs that surrounds D.C., and both its parishioners and its clergy tend to be more conservative than those at St. John the Baptist. St. John's was about 4 miles from our home, and St. Pete's about 7, and the roads to St. John's were wider, newer, straighter, and safer than those to St. Pete's. I should explain that while in service in the 1950s, my father was horribly injured while on duty. He laid agonizing in hospital and was fearful that his life would end before it truly began. Dad prayed to God to save him and promised that if he lived, he would become a medical doctor and dedicate himself to saving people. The only problem with that promise was a little something called organic chemistry. Hey, we all have our Achilles heels. Organic chemistry stymied Dad's specific plan, but not his promise to help others. Upon deciding that becoming a medical doctor was beyond him, Dad stumbled across the nascent field of traffic safety. My dad went on to be a pioneer in driver education and traffic safety, and I am sure that his efforts saved far more lives over the course of his career than he probably would have as an MD. So he followed the intent, if not the specifics of his promise. And it was safety that had us attend St. John's that day, and safety that had Frank conflicted as well as a bit apoplectic, and what caused Dad to literally storm the pulpit, poke the priest's chest with his finger, and tell him that he was putting his congregation in danger. We had gone to St. John the Baptist because there was heavy fog that Sunday. At the end of services, Father said, "I didn't know this was true, but AAA says not to drive with your headlights on in the fog," as part of his closing remarks to the departing congregation. My 14-year-old self watched in fascination as my dad heard what the priest said, processed what it meant, agonized for half a second on what to do, and then stormed the Bastille. You see, by that time, Dad was director of traffic safety at AAA, and the priest, a man of great authority, had just told his flock to do something Dad felt could easily get some of them sheared. Dad had to refute the priest's ill-informed but well-meant message, and he had to do it right then because even one more second would be too late. Dad decided to act. Imagine 46-year-old, 230-pound, 6 feet 4-inch Frank Kennel rushing up to you with angst in his face, and you can probably see why the priest was not in a position to hear Dad's message that no, contrary to what Father thought he had heard, people absolutely should drive with their low beams on in low visibility conditions like fog. I'm pretty sure most of us would have been in fear for our lives under those conditions, especially when we add to the mix that since Dad was in such turmoil that after a few seconds of whispered but obviously heated exchange between the fearful priest and my ever more agitated dad, that he said loudly enough for the whole church to hear, "Damn it, I am the AAA!" Even in my youth, I understood the conflict, his need to act, and the Don Quixote tilting at windmills essence of his attempt to seize the moment and fulfill his deathbed promise to save lives that he made to the God that he loved. Rallying behind a worthy but hopeless cause is surely the work of a prince. We never did go back to celebrate Mass at St. John the Baptist. When he became agitated, Dad would sustain himself with his Roman Catholic faith. Dad started making trips to his father's native country of Switzerland in the 1980s, and after exploring his roots, he discovered his extended family there, and so he visited every few years. When he took one of my brothers, me, and both of our wives to visit his cousin's family in Grandpa's hometown of Arth, the following decade, a child of Dad's first cousin asked me, "Why is your father so religious?" The cousin, who was a contemporary of mine, found it odd that Dad attended Mass weekly and on holy days whenever he visited. Dad's Catholicism defined him. He and Mom were insistent that we receive religious education, the sacraments, and that we attend church with them. Many of the views Dad had cherished as progressive in his youth were now being judged as reactionary by many who had not been here quite so long, something that is likely to happen to any of us if we live over 8 decades. I know Dad was proud that all of his children were married in church services and of our great good fortune in finding spouses with whom we can share our lives to the ends of our days. I am confident that Dad's and Mom's example illuminated the path for us on that score. To me, my father was a prince among men. Though he had his faults, his failings, his feet of clay, I will miss him and his loving, if not always gentle hand. I pray that he and Mom are at peace and reunited. Thank you for all the love, the examples of how to conduct ourselves, and the glorious gift of you, Dad. We'll look to you as inspiration as we try to fill your shoes with our own feet of clay.